pen flew across the counter and hit Naomi in the chest. Not hard, not enough to bruise, just enough to sting, just enough to send a message. Take that to the welfare office, the white teller said with a smug nasal voice that cut through the quiet hum of the bank. Loud enough that people in 3 different lines turned to look. Naomi Hayes stood still. She didn't look down at the pen. She didn't move her hand, which still held a manila folder inside it. Her corporate documentation, her ID, and a freshly notarized letter granting her full financial authority over one of the largest property development firms in the state. But in this moment, none of that mattered. To this man, standing on the other side of the glass counter, she was just a nuisance, a problem, black woman who didn't belong. I said this line's for business clients only. The teller repeated himself, slower this time, dragging out each word like she was a child needing discipline. His lips curled up slightly. A performance meant for the audience behind her. Someone chuckled under their breath. Another person whispered, probably trying to cash someone else's check. Naomi swallowed hard. Not because she was afraid, but because her throat had closed up with all the words she wanted to say, but wouldn't. Not yet. She calmly lifted the pen from where it had fallen against her blazer. Her fingers were steady, but her chest was burning. I am a business client. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried enough strength to command the space, near to authorize a wire transfer. From a commercial account, the teller didn't even glance at her folder. He leaned over and pressed a button beneath the counter. Within seconds, a manager appeared, a woman with tightly pinned blonde hair and a rehearsed customer service smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ma'am, we've asked you nicely. If you don't have your employer's approval or credentials, you'll need to leave. Naomi turned slightly, holding up the folder. This is my business. These are my credentials. The manager cut her off with a dismissive wave. We don't have time to verify fabricated documents. Fabricated the word. Hit harder than the pen, she looked around. The line behind her was filled with eyes, some amused, some blank, some quietly entertained by the spectacle. No one said a word. No one offered to help. Naomi felt like she had been pulled out of time and dropped into a cruel, slower world, where the color of her skin still decided whether she belonged. She could feel the heat rise up her neck. Not from shame, but from the deep, choking anger of being told, once again, that success didn't change how they saw her. She had built a multi-million-dollar firm from the ground up. She had offices in 4 states. She employed over 200 people, and she still wasn't welcome here. Before she could speak again, the manager turned her back and said over her shoulder, "If you don't leave, we'll have to involve security." Naomi didn't argue. She turned, picked up her folder, and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, each step echoing like a promise. But the moment she stepped outside the branch's glass doors, her legs trembled. Not because she was weak, because she was exhausted from years of this. The subtle digs, the outright refusals. The way some people smiled while stabbing her dignity in full view of a silent crowd, she leaned against her black Escalade, parked at the front with corporate plates that nobody inside the bank had bothered to notice for a second. She closed her eyes. She didn't cry. Instead, she remembered the school counselor who said girls like her didn't belong in business programs. She remembered the landlord who called her aggressive when she challenged the rent hike. The client who asked if he could speak to the real owner. She remembered the words of her grandmother, soft and steady. "Baby, gone. Have to be fire in a world that keeps trying to drown you." Naomi opened her eyes. She wasn't done. Not today, because what the bank didn't know, what those smug little faces behind the glass counter had missed, was that the building they were standing in belonged to her company, and all it would take was one call. Naomi didn't go home. Right away, she drove without direction, the city blurring past her windows as buildings turned into shadows and familiar streets lost their names. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. Her phone buzzed twice, first with a text from her assistant asking if she'd signed the permits, and then a calendar alert reminding her of a board. "Call in 30 minutes. She didn't answer either. Instead, she pulled into a quiet parking lot beside an old community center and turned off the engine. The silence inside the SUV was loud. It pressed against her ribs and filled her throat with something too heavy to swallow. She She had been here before, not this parking lot, but the space of invisible weight. The space where the world refused to see her and then blamed her for being invisible as a child. She used to sit on her grandmother's porch and stare into the distance, wondering if grown-up life would finally make her feel like she belonged. But here she was, nearly 40, a successful CEO, mother to a teenage daughter, property owner, employer, taxpayer, and still, they had tossed a pen at her like she was nothing. Still, they had called her documents fake. Still, she had walked out, feeling more exposed than if they'd stripped her of her clothes right there in front of everyone. She was so tired, and the worst part, she couldn't even talk about it. Who would understand the board? Say, don't make it public. Avoid bad press. Her assistant. She was sweet but young, still too hopeful to grasp this kind of humiliation. Her best friend had moved to Seattle last year and barely returned calls. Her daughter, Kennedy, Naomi didn't want her to carry any of this. Not yet. So she sat there, quiet, alone, when she finally made it home. Yes! Had already painted the sky in bruised shades of orange and blue. Her heels clicked softly against the marble foyer floor of the house she had bought with cash 5 years. Go! The house she had once dreamed of filling with laughter and dinner parties and music, but now echoed only with silence. Kennedy's bedroom door was closed, a strip of light spilling from underneath. Naomi didn't knock. She couldn't, not when her own emotions felt so jagged they might cut anyone who came close. She poured herself a glass of water in the kitchen and sat at the dining table, staring at the darkened glass door that led to the empty backyard. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Martin, her ex-husband. I hope you're still making time for Kennedy between those mergers. She said you canceled on her school performance again. She blinked slowly. It wasn't true. She had been there, in the back row. She had clapped. She had cried. She had brought flowers, but she hadn't gone backstage. Hadn't wanted to risk the red in her eyes being seen. Kennedy hadn't even known she was there. Martin hadn't asked. She typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. She finally locked the phone and slid it across the table. Her mind began to wander to the neighbors across the street who still waved but never invited her in, to the country club that welcomed her money but asked her to wear a badge like she was someone's +1, to the banker today who looked through her like her achievements were invisible armor he refused to acknowledge, and then to her grandmother, her voice soft as sunlight. You've gone be tired. Maybe they've gone test you, break you, make you wanna throw up your hands. That's when you gotta plant your feet the hardest. Naomi closed her eyes. The tears came quietly, soft apologies falling down her cheeks. She didn't sob, didn't break, just let them run. Later that night, she stood in the hallway, looking at old family photos hung across the wall. Kennedy at 6 in her first ballet recital, her and Martin before the divorce, both smiling but already distant. A photo of her grandmother with hands worn like river stones and eyes that saw too much that night. She slept in her daughter's empty bed. Kennedy had gone to her friend's house for the weekend. The soft scent of her daughter's lavender hair cream clung to the pillow. For the first time in weeks, Naomi slept without waking. The next morning, she went into the office early, hoping to beat the staff, avoid conversation, sit in silence, but silence didn't come. As she stepped out of the elevator, Jerome, her coup, called after her. Rough morning, Pascal, eyes scanning her face, noticing the tightness around her. Jaw dot, she nodded once. You good? She nodded again, nodded again. He hesitated, then placed a hand gently on her arm, his voice lowered, serious. You don't have to be bulletproof every day, Naomi. She froze. Something about the way he said it, not as a comfort, not as pity, but as truth, cracked something in her chest, but she didn't speak, just offered a quiet thank you and walked to her office. It was later that afternoon. While reviewing vendor contracts, that something small changed. Her assistant, Maya, knocked softly before entering. She had a coffee in one hand and a folded napkin in the other. I know you didn't ask, but it looked like you needed this. Naomi raised an eyebrow. What's this? Open it. Inside the napkin was a homemade cookie, slightly uneven, clearly. Baked with love. My Annie taught me to bake these when I had bad days in college. I keep extras in my desk for people I love. Naomi blinked. The words hung in the air, unpolished, unrehearsed, real. Thank you, Naomi whispered, her voice catching. Maya smiled. and left without saying more. And just like that, something shifted. Not big, not loud, just enough. A seed planted in soil hardened by years of struggle. That evening, as Naomi sat in the quiet office alone, she thought of the bank again, the laughter, the pen, the stares. But this time, she also thought of Maya and Jerome, and the fact that the building did belong to her company, and that somewhere deep in her files, for like a trespass, she opened her laptop. The tiredness hadn't vanished. The shame still clung to her ribs like a bruise. But something inside her had started breathing again. She wasn't ready to burn bridges, but she was ready to build new. Ones no one could deny she owned. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they remembered exactly who Naomi Hayes was. 3 days later, Naomi stood outside the bank again. She hadn't meant to come here, not consciously. She'd been driving home from a vendor meeting and turned down the wrong street. At least that's what she told herself. The truth, something had been pulling her back, not out of revenge, not yet, but curiosity, reflection. A need to understand why that moment still lived in her bones. Like a fresh wound, the building looked ordinary from the outside. Brick walls, glass doors, a logo to clean, to be personal. But Naomi could still feel the invisible weight of what had happened inside those walls. And that's when something clicked. Not in anger, but clarity. This wasn't just about her. That bank, that building, wasn't the first place to treat her like a stranger in her own city. It wouldn't be the last. But she owned the land it stood on. Her company held the lease to the entire strip mall the branch occupied. Bought it 3 years ago through a real estate shell corporation under her parent company. No one at the bank had ever connected the dots. She was just another customer to them, and that was the mistake. That was the moment she realized she wasn't powerless. It wasn't a lightning strike. It wasn't a roar, just a quiet whisper in her chest. You don't have to let them do. This to you still? The next morning she hesitated before opening the property portfolio. Her hand hovered over the file as if touching it would unleash a storm. The voice in her head, the one that had grown loud over years of being overlooked, whispered warnings. What if they laugh again? What if you overstep? What if you're just being sensitive? Her office, her mind drifted back to her childhood, to her mother who had cleaned houses during the day and packed boxes at night. Naomi had once asked her why she never complained. Her mother had said, "I don't have time to complain. I have time to survive." That's it. Naomi had promised herself she would do more than survive. Now, even with all her power and titles, she felt like that little girl again, standing in the shadows, waiting to be told she didn't belong. She sat down again and opened the folder. Inside were the original lease contracts, mapped zoning files, and a few recent inspection reports. The bank's lease had come up for renewal 6 months ago and had been auto-extended under a 5-year clause. But the clause included a review period, one she still had the right to reopen under the terms of ethical or discriminatory conduct affecting ownership interests. She stared at the words like they were written in fire. It was vague enough to be ignored, or sharp enough to demand attention. But did she want to fight this? Did she have the energy? They closed the folder again. That afternoon, Maya knocked on her door. Hey, sorry, I know it's late, but there's a woman at reception asking for you. Naomi looked up, confused. Who? She didn't give a name. Said you wouldn't know her, but she looked stressed. Wanted to thank you for something. Naomi hesitated, then stood. The woman waiting in the lobby wore a tired gray coat and clutched a folder to her chest. She looked up as Naomi approached. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said. I found this in the trash outside the bank. Clean the sidewalks there. I wasn't trying to be nosy, I swear, but it had your name. And the way they were talking, handed Naomi the folder. Inside were internal bank memos, printed pages. Some highlighted about a high-risk client who had caused a scene with notes recommending a review of identification protocols for non-typical business persons. Naomi's breath hitched. The woman smiled nervously. I just seen them treat others like that. I didn't want you to think nobody noticed. Naomi blinked. Slowly, thank you. What's your name? Do you have work tomorrow? No. Off day, Naomi nodded. Like to invite you for lunch here. My treat. The woman's eyes widened. You. The next day, Alicia returned. They ate in Naomi's office, grilled chicken wraps and bottled iced tea. Alicia spoke about her 3 kids, her years in the service industry, the little tricks she used to clean chewing gum off sidewalks. Naomi listened more than she spoke. At one point, Alicia leaned in and said, "You're not like most people with money. You don't talk down. That's rare." Naomi smiled faintly. "I know what it's like to be unseen that night." Naomi sat at her dining table and reopened the lease file. She read every page, and then she picked up the phone. "Hi, Jerome. I need you to schedule a legal review meeting. Property compliance. Want to evaluate the Sunset Plaza lease renewals? Especially the bank? It's that one." She hung up and exhaled. Something had shifted. It wasn't fire, it wasn't fury. It was something deeper. The quiet strength of someone who had been broken but was still standing. She remembered the old oak tree in her grandmother's yard. How it never bent in storms but stood there, roots deep, arms wide. Even when the sky turned black. That's what she wanted to be now. Not angry, not small, just rooted. She showed up to work the next morning in a charcoal gray suit and no makeup. She didn't need armor. She needed truth. Jerome had already assembled the legal team. As they reviewed the ethical clause, one of the junior attorneys pointed out a rarely used owner authority section, a clause that gave Naomi the right to recommend public review of tenant behavior if it posed reputational harm to the ownership group. It was a technicality, but it was her technicality. Naomi leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. This wasn't about removing a tenant. It was about saying, you don't get to treat people like that, not on my property, not under my name. That weekend, she drove Kennedy to her friend's birthday party across town. As they rode in silence, Kennedy asked softly, "Mom, you okay?" Naomi smiled. "Why do you ask?" "You've been different, not sad, just quiet, like strong quiet." Naomi gripped the wheel. "I'm learning to be a different kind of strong." Kennedy reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "I like this kind." When Naomi returned home that night, she sat on the couch and thought about her next steps. She didn't want to be vindictive, but she did want to use her power with precision. To send a message that what happened wasn't okay and that no one else would be made to feel the way she had. She drafted an email to her legal team, subject line, "Tenant Ethics Review." Request for public statement clause, and then 4. The first time in weeks, she turned off her phone, poured herself a cup of tea, and watched the sunset from her back patio. It was just a small step, a folded napkin, a sidewalk conversation, a hidden clause in a forgotten lease. But sometimes, that's how healing begins. Not with a roar, but with a whisper that says, you're allowed to fight back. Fight back.